Chair. Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I rise on behalf of the Green Party to speak to Part 3 of this bill, which is in relation to the Intelligence and Security Committee, and endorse the comments of Mr Grant Robertson, who gave an excellent speech. And I very much really appreciate the direction of the Labor Party policy in this particular matter. After the 2003 bill, which the Greens did support. Anyway, so Part 3 of this bill, the Intelligence and Security Committee. So this committee, so think about it, this is meant to be a committee which is supposed to provide oversight over the agencies. The Minister responsible for the agencies chairs the committee. So we already have got a pretty big problem of conflict of interest in terms of oversight. And unfortunately this bill doesn't fix that. So the Intelligence and Security Committee has 5 members, so it's the Minister who chairs it, it's the Leader of the Opposition, and then the Leader of Opposition nominates 1 person and the Minister nominates 2. I've been fortunate enough, I was nominated by Mr Goff when he was Leader of the Opposition, thank you Mr Goff, to be on the committee, and then I was nominated by David Shearer to be on the committee. And having been on the committee now for some time, I'm well aware of its extreme limitations and the limitations in its ability to provide the kind of oversight that I think New Zealanders would expect a committee of parliamentarians to provide. And I think it's most unfortunate that we don't have the kind of oversight of the GCSB and the SAS that I think most New Zealanders would like us to have. And essentially that's because the structure of the committee doesn't provide it. You basically have the Minister responsible, who has enormous role within the GCSB and the SAS. It's not a stand-apart role. The Minister responsible for the GCSB. It's very much in control of what the GCSB does. That Minister also controls the Intelligence and Security Committee. So it's very difficult to get any kind of real independent oversight in that situation when the Minister controls both the Oversight Committee and the agency itself. I thought it was interesting that the last review done of these agencies were in the first calendar year of the Muldoon government, because a lot of what's been going on lately certainly reminds me of Muldoonism, and so it is a most interesting coincidence. I think it's also important to understand that the Intelligence and Security Committee is very highly constrained in what it can do. It has very few powers to inquire into what these agencies are doing. So even if the Prime Minister were of a mind to allow the committee to inquire into the operations of the GCSB and the SAS, the committee itself has enormous constraints on what it can inquire into. A normal regular select committee has a lot of power to require departments and so forth and officials to appear in front of it and to inquire into their activities. The Intelligence and Security Committee, I'm afraid, has very few of those kinds of powers in order to inquire into what these agencies are doing, particularly in relation to operational matters. Now, other jurisdictions, as Mr Robertson had pointed out, have given their oversight committees much greater powers, as well as having independent people on the committee, so making sure the committee isn't controlled by the Minister who's also controlling the agency that the committee is supposed to be providing oversight of, and they also give the committee much greater powers. The Americans, for example, under the US system, the committees have the power of subpoena. So if you're a spy working in an agency and you're working unlawfully, which of course we've now found the GCSB has been operating unlawfully on over 80 occasions, if you're a spy who is operating unlawfully, your fear is that the oversight committees could subpoena you to appear in front of them, and you could be forced to give testimony which would effectively incriminate you for operating in an unlawful manner. The Intelligence and Security Committee in New Zealand has no such powers. We can't demand that spies appear in front of us. We can't demand that they testify and tell us about what they've been doing and about their unlawful activities. The GCSB can simply say, no, we don't wish to discuss that matter if we were to ask about it, and that's the end of the matter. We can't make them tell us things. And if there's any question about whether we might be able to make them tell us things or not, the Prime Minister chairing the committee can prevent any testimony and can prevent any attempt to drag officials before the committee. So there's no threat. The committee has no power, like it has no stick. It can't force people to do anything. So why on earth would an agency which has been operating unlawfully on many dozens and dozens of occasions have anything to fear from this committee? And unfortunately, the changes that the government's proposing don't change any of that at all. What I've done in my supplementary order paper or amendment to this proposed bill, to this bill in front of the House, Mr. Chair,
Dr. Norman.
Is that I've proposed to remove some of those constraints. So under my supplementary order paper 313, basically amending what the committee can do. So giving the committee much greater powers to inquire into what the agencies are doing, the very agencies that the committee is supposed to be providing oversight of. And I think that that's quite an important amendment to make, because if we don't give the committee those kind of powers, ordinary New Zealanders are looking at this committee and thinking, well, you know, OK, the spies, we don't know what they do, but there are these elected people up there who do know what the spies are doing. Ordinary people would look at the committee and think, well, there are these people, this Intelligence and Security Committee, who do know what the spies are doing, so at least someone is watching the spies. The problem is that if the Intelligence and Security Committee doesn't have the powers to actually investigate into what these agencies are doing, then I'm afraid ordinary New Zealanders are being misled if they think that the Intelligence and Security Committee has the powers to provide a proper oversight function. It simply does not. So it doesn't have the powers, it's dominated by the minister who is responsible for the agency. It simply can't do the functions that it's basically, I think, all of us expect it to do. I'd also like to talk about the review process that's been proposed here by Mr. Dunn. Now, I don't wish to impugn Mr. Dunn's motives, because I think that he genuinely does want to put in a review process into this legislation. But I think, however, it is, confusing to people following the debate to think that the review process that Mr. Dunn is proposing is anything like the kind of review process that the Labor Party and the Green Party have been proposing. They are entirely different beasts. This is not the kind of review that would look at the agencies as a whole, why they exist, what they're there for, what kind of structure they should have, their purpose. It is a much narrower review, and there's absolutely no requirement for the review to be concluded and its recommendations to be put in place, for example. And by analogy, I would refer people to the MMP review. If we were to think about, well, what kind of review do we have here? After the referendum on MMP, when New Zealanders voted to keep MMP, there was a promise by the government that there would be a review. And there was a review by the Electoral Commission, which is an independent agency. It came up with a series of significant recommendations to amend the system. However, the government of the day, for purely partisan political reasons, decided to implement none of them. So it's all very well to have a review within this bill and within this legislation, but just having a review does not guarantee that any of the recommendations will actually be implemented. It doesn't guarantee the kind of depth of review that might be required, particularly in light of the malfeasance and illegal activities of these organisations. They clearly need a pretty serious review when they've been operating illegally on dozens and dozens of occasions. It doesn't guarantee the kind of depth of review that we need, and there's no guarantee that it will reach conclusions and those conclusions will be implemented. And of course the review will be appointed by the Prime Minister. Of course it won't be an independent review, it will be people appointed by the Prime Minister. So while I certainly think and will be supporting Mr. Dunn's proposals around the review, and you know, good on Mr. Dunn for getting them, nonetheless it does not change the fundamental problems of this bill. And Mr. Dunn still has an opportunity to change his vote on this bill, and I would strongly urge him to do so. I would also urge the ACT Party to do the same. It is completely anathema to the very founding principles of the ACT Party that the ACT Party is voting for a bill that significantly increased state powers, that does not significantly increase the powers of oversight within the Intelligence and Security Committee within Part 3. So how can the ACT Party, a party that's supposedly based on a principle of liberty and freedom, be voting for a bill that in Part 1 dramatically increases the powers of state surveillance, but in Part 3 provides very few increase, virtually no increase in terms of the ability of the elected representatives on the Intelligence and Security Committee to actually provide better oversight of these big increase in powers? How can that be consistent with a party that says it's built on a principle of freedom and liberty to vote for a big increase in state surveillance in Part 1 but not match that by a big increase in the ability of the democratically elected representatives to provide oversight of that increase in surveillance powers in Part 3, the part that we're discussing at the moment. And that is why I think anyone who believes in freedom should vote against this bill.
Mr. Chairman.
I'll take Paul Goldsmith.